Thank you, Tamar. In our last lecture together, we will turn to Greece in the late 19th and 20th centuries. It is during this time that we witness Salonika being one of the most distinguished and confident Jewish cities in the world. Let's zoom out first and see what is happening to our Jews at this time in Greece, and then zoom in again to Salonika, as this is where obviously most of our Jews are living. It is worthwhile, I think, to use Salonika as our main example of Jewish life in the 20th century. The actual number of Jews who lived at the turn of the 18th century in Greece that were eventually to become the modern Greek state is unknown. But our Jewish communities in 19th and 19th centuries were complex, independent, and sharply defined and different from each other, more so than in any other country that we might choose to visit. Broadly speaking, Romaniot Jews, the Greek-speaking ethnic Jewish community native to the Eastern Mediterranean, were found mainly in the western part of Greece, such as Epirus, where three very old communities existed: Ioannina, in Corfu, Arta, and Preveza. The Jews of Zakynthos, or the island of Zante, who had lived under Venetian rule, maintained close association with the Jews of Harnia in Crete that dated back to before the Ottoman conquest of the island in the 17th century. The Jews of Crete had very ancient roots extending into the period before the Common Era, as you might remember from our first lecture. The Peloponnesians had many communities, all of them, such as Patras, Mistra, and Modon, being very ancient and mainly Romaniot, though a few names indicate that some of the members of these communities were Ashkenazic and had probably been established in the 16th century or later. The east and central parts of mainland Greece were heavily Sephardic, after the Sephardi Jews had begun to arrive from Spain and later Portugal early in the 15th century, after the massacres of 1391. If you look north to this picture at the top, Salonika and Drama in the north, Vivimot Eko in the north at the top here on the right, and Kavala were the great centers of the Sephardim well into the 20th century. So now let us think about Salonika in a little more detail. Well, due to its strategic position on the Via Egnatia, the great Roman road stretching from Rome to Constantinople and uniting the west and the east, Salonika had always been the central metropolis of the Balkan Peninsula. At the same time, the port of Salonika on the Thermaic Gulf constituted the main outlet of the Macedonian hinterland to the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. But let's give Salonika a little bit more history here. The city had been founded in 315 before the Common Era and named after Thessalonikia, the half-sister of Alexander the Great. It is believed that the first Jews had settled here in Salonika in 140 before the Common Era. After the entrance of the large number of Sephardi Jews that I mentioned last time, Salonika came to be known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans, or as the acclaimed Samuel Ask in the Portuguese Converso in his verse called it the metropolis of Israel. In 1821, the Greeks began their struggle for independence. Following the intervention of the great powers, Russia, Britain, France, and Germany, Greece becomes independent in 1830. In 1833, the Bavarian Prince Otto was named the first king in Greece. But Salonika was not part of this newly formed entity, which covered the southern and central region of today's Greece, often referred as the Palea Ellada. Salonika was only absorbed by Greece in 1912 after the Second Balkan War, when the modern state of Greece seized Salonika and absorbed it into itself, a city that was predominantly Jewish, Spanish-speaking, and if not Ottoman in some of its sympathies, having a character decidedly of its own. And until the Second World War, the city would remain with 2/3 of Greek Jewry living there in Salonika. 75,000 Jews. And look how the Jews used postcards to show a clean and beautiful image of Jewish life in Salonika. These women are well dressed and official. In other postcards, we see professions being shown in Salonika. Porters at the port were one of the most important professions in Salonika. What else do we witness? Where else do we witness a population, a Jewish population like this in Europe? This meant that over 1/3 of its population was Jewish. Its Christian population was made up of Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, and Armenians. But let's take this argument a little bit further. The Jews of Salonika were the undisputed masters in almost all sectors of the economy. They represented all social classes, and Jews were to be found in every profession. They were industrialists, bankers, businessmen, merchants, middlemen, agents, as well as peddlers, porters, sailors, and skilled and unskilled workers. Until the middle of 1890, there were 17 Jewish neighborhoods, along with 2 Greek and 2 Turkish ones, that extended as far as the northeastern end of Salonika, taking up the entire center of the town and the seafront. The majority of the Jewish quarters mentioned in the Ottoman fiscal records also had Judeo-Spanish names: Rogas, Puglia, Baro, Bedaron, Malta, Eitz Chaim, Aguda, and Levie, etc., etc. Many of its streets as well had Judeo-Spanish and sometimes Turkified names in honor of local rabbis or synagogues, such as you can see, Casilia Chavrasi, Dijadesi, Chacham Asher, Chacham Matalon, and Boyadi David, or David the painter. And several of these names were still in use when Salonika was annexed to Greece. The commercial ports of the commercial centers of the city were limited in size and densely populated: the agora, or marketplace, and the port. And these centers contained the highest concentration, just go back for a second, of business and professional activity. There were Jewish newspapers, cultural centers, several schools, many book presses, hospitals, orphanages, and homes for the aged. Unfortunately, we do not have photographs of the exterior or the interior of any of the 30+ synagogues of Salonika, not to mention those in other cities and towns in Greece. By 1878, Ottoman reforms had demanded the reorganization of the Jewish community under the control of efficient secular leadership. And with the industrialization in the 19th century, a number of wealthy Jewish families played an important role in the city's development, the most famous one being the Alatini and the Hirsch families. In 1858, Moses Alatini, whose family owned a large bank, founded the Alatini flour mills, And this building still exists in Salonika today. In 1871, Baron Hirsch, an Austrian Jew, funded the construction of a railway line between Salonika and Skopje. Beside the construction of an industrial infrastructure, these families also financed the creation of an urban welfare structure which provided housing and helping for the poor. The famous Baron Hirsch Hospital, we'll just go back for a second to the Hirsch Hospital, as you can see, was built in 1907, and the Alatini orphanage in 1911. This modernization of Salonika went hand in hand with the opening of schools, where language of instruction were now Italian, French, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the mission Lek Français or German, to make the Greeks more Europeanized. Can you imagine a European city where its commercial life came to a standstill on Friday evenings until the end of the Jewish Shabbat? So let's look at Salonika a little more closely in the 20th century. In starting, we must see Salonika as this Sephardic island entering a troubling sea of nationalism. In the 20th century, it goes through a series of historically important events, which means that it is never the same again. And I will take you through them. These include the annexation of the city by the Greek state in 1912, the Great Fire of 1917, the new education policies for Jewish schooling that existed, and I mentioned already, at the beginning of the 20th century, the increase of anti-Semitism within Greece, and the Campbell riot in 1930, of course, the coming of Nazism in 1941, but the survival in Greece and its downsized reconstruction in the post-war years. So let's start with the annexation of the city by the Greek state in 1912. Greece, in its attempts to become an independent national state, doubles the size of its territory, owing to the leadership of King Constantine I that you see here and Prime Minister Venizelos. Economic prosperity, social and cultural progress quickly followed military success. In 1912, with the absorption of Salonika into the modern Greek state, it was inevitable that things were going to change. The rise of Balkan nationalism, the subsequent incorporation of the Jews into national status, overturned their Ottoman entity and forced them to seek modern and parallel ideological patterns in order to relocate themselves economically. The circumstances of life under Greek rule also demanded from the Jews a more modern and integrated Jewish existence. Salonican Jewry had been renowned for its sense of apartness, both vis-à-vis other Jewish communities and the Greek Orthodox Christians. From the Greek point of view, because Salonika was a much larger city than Athens, and because of the definitions characterizing all nationalisms in the 19th century, the Jews were going to present a problem. Although the Greek government assured equal rights to its Jewish citizens, in many ways emancipating them, as Jews had been done too in Western Europe, the Jews of Salonika did not really trust the Greek government. They had been content to live under the Ottomans and did not really want change. But the Salonican Jews are forced to rethink how to accommodate this new situation. Some chose departure, others assimilation, secularization, and even once again, Hellenization, as we had talked about it in our first lecture, as some of their ancient predecessors had done. A first wave of Jewish emigration from Greece to the United States, to France, to Argentina, and the United Kingdom occurred around 1910. Those who stayed convinced themselves that the Greek had some good things to offer them. Jews could now go to university, and serving in the military was mandatory. But even this was not easy. It was hard to be recruited into the Greek army because the Jews' loyalties remained with the Turks. Though some Jewish families in Chalkis did actually fight on the side of the Greeks. Now in Greece, siding with the Turks obviously would result in hostility and persecution. There were also local changes that the Jews had to get used to, imposed by Prime Minister Venizelos. The weekly market that was held on Monday was transferred to Saturday. Until now, the market had not occurred on Shabbat, on Saturdays, because the Jews could not work in it or attend it. Yet because the 70,000 Jewish residents of Salonika outnumbered the 40,000 Greeks and 5,000 Bulgarians now living in the city, their majority position in the city made it easy for them to say, no, we're not making this change. And they were able to repeal the law at this stage. But some of the Jews' venerable monuments were destroyed, and the Jews viewed these attacks upon their rights and liberties as a manifestation of an overall de-Judaization policy in Salonika, a reduction of Salonika's Jewish character. In 1916, Venizelos led a successful revolution against the monarchy, and soon after, in 1917, he formally brought Greece into World War I. Jews fought on the side of the Greeks during the First World War. But afterwards, many Jews emigrated again to Belgrade, to Milan, to Marseille and Lyon in France. And then we have what's known in Salonika as the Great Fire of 1917. While all of these changes were being made for our Jews of Greece, the sense that they had to be much more nationalistic than they had ever been before. A devastating fire destroyed almost all of the Jewish quarter of Salonika on the 18th of August, 1917, almost 107 years ago. It was in the heat of the summer, the time when us Israelis worry about summer fires in the woodlands of Israel. Salonika was vulnerable to fire. Its houses were of wood and built cheek by jowl beside one another along narrow streets. The 1917 fire destroyed the center of Salonika within a period of 32 hours. The Balkan News noted that the fire brigade hoses were so riddled with holes that more water leaked out of them than came out of their nozzles. The fire destroyed mainly Jewish areas in the center of town and led to the Jewish metropolis of the city being closed and a relocation of Jewish neighborhoods to the outskirts of the city. One of the largest Jewish libraries of the world was destroyed, along with 9 other rabbinical libraries. 600 Torah scrolls were destroyed, some very ancient. 8 schools, 5 of them being run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, that I will mention more about in a moment. Also destroyed was the rabbinic publishing house, Eitz Chaim, and archives of the chief rabbinate. All the synagogues were consumed by fire. Inevitably, this was the beginning of a formal and unchangeable Hellenization and modernization of Salonika. The Greeks now had the chance to play a decisive role in rebuilding. Grand stone buildings, as you see here, wide avenues, would replace the wooden houses and narrow streets of the Jewish communities. Christian churches would take the place of Ottoman minarets and the arched doorways of synagogues. Greek legislation forbade reconstruction undertaken on an individual basis, laying the ground for a systematic program of urban redevelopment. The city Jews in particular saw this policy to a degree quite accurately as designed in large part to further limit their future influence. Between 40 and 50,000 Jews were displaced by the fire, along with 10,000 Muslims and between 10 to 15,000 Christians. Tents, as you see, and improvised barracks were set up to house the survivors, and the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which had some intact properties, began distribution of food, blankets, and clothing. During the brutal winter of 1918 to 1919, 1,569 Jews died within a month. And what was rebuilt in Salonika was not simply the physical city, but its human texture was completely reworked as well. Without doubt, the fire left scars on the whole body of Greek Jewry. It was a turning point and the first of many events which marked the diminishing strength of the Greek Jewish communities, making our Jews more elusive than they had ever been before. It also foreshadowed, of course, the more deadly Nazi oppression which would sweep into Greece. The Jewish communities became more overtly politicized and dichotomized, divided between Zionism, socialism, and less markedly in favor of Venizelos, the prime minister. In 1909, Abraham Ben-Oroya, a Bulgarian Jew, found the socialist organization, Fédération Socialiste Ouvrière, and thus introduced socialism to Salonika. In 1918, the Jewish community bought 3 areas which had been used before as military camps by the Entente powers in the First World War, and which subsequently became Jewish working class neighborhoods. The neighborhoods number 6, number 151, and as you see here, Campbell. Jewish areas were now located in today's western part of the city. So now, let's take a little closer look at how Jewish education changes in Salonika and more generally in Greece at this time. One of the most important contributions to life in Greek Salonika were the Jewish schools that were set up by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which had been formed, of course, in post-emancipatory France in 1860 by Adolphe Crémière, known best as this forceful advocate of the 1848 revolution. Between the early 1860s and the start of the First World War, the Alliance established a modern educational network throughout Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. In 1873, the first Alliance school came to Salonika, and ultimately, the city had 9 such schools. These schools, of their own accord, aimed to further Jewish equality through education and foster Jews' integration into broader society. Undoubtedly, what this necessarily entailed was secularization, especially in the first decades of the 20th century, with all the momentous changes going on, and such pictures that we have seen of Jews previously are not what Jews look like at this time. But the schools also allowed changes to occur in the occupational status of the new generation of Greek Jews. Greek Jews educated in these Alliance schools acquired new skills, a knowledge of French, of course, which helped them become merchants with access not only to European culture, but also to European markets. During its 35-year of operation in Salonika, the Alliance Israélite Universelle managed to educate approximately 8,500 children. The Alliance students all found work upon graduation, holding the best positions in the banks, in the shops, in administration, and other services. So now we don't just have Salonican Jews serving as doctors, lawyers, architects, journalists, and teachers. Alliance schools also trained apprentices to do manual, vocational, and agricultural work. By 1920, only 3 years after the catastrophic fire, each of the Jewish neighborhoods had its own boys and girls schools, a synagogue, permanent medical service, and facilities including a clinic and an adjacent communal pharmacy, public baths, and a food cooperative. But again, our Salonican Jews are confronted, as other Jews were in other parts of Greece, with a large influx of Greek nationals from other parts of the Ottoman Empire. Because after the First World War, a final peace agreement between Greece and Turkey stipulated a general population exchange. About 1,100,000 Greeks, classified as Greek by their Orthodox religion, came to Greece, and about 380,000 Turks, that is Muslims, were now transferred to Turkey. In Salonika, this population exchange brought about a radical change in the makeup of its inhabitants. More than 100,000 Christian refugees came into the city, increasing the Christian population by half. Now, the Jewish population in Salonika is reduced to 25%. And the Greek state awards these new refugees special rights, which allow them to sell their merchandise in front of Jewish stores and exempted them from normal rent and tax payments. Venizelos took advantage of this demographic shift in Salonika to again propose in 1922 a public law, Law number 236, forcing Salonika's residents to refrain from work on Sunday. This time, the law was rigidly enforced by Salonika's local authorities. Shutting their shops on Saturday, Sunday, and all Jewish holidays would amount to too many closing days a year for our Jews. Moreover, the Jews felt this personal loss in the loss of heritage, which long associated their presence in Salonika with the closing of the port and all commercial vendors on the Jewish Shabbat. Those Jews who could not accept working on the Jewish Shabbat emigrated to Palestine and France, but the majority of Jews remained in Greece and opened their stores on Saturday. Greek was now made the compulsory first language in all of the schools. But another issue at this time was the rise of anti-Semitism as a result of the arrival of these new Christians into Greece. In 1923, 2 Jewish scrap metal merchants were accused of tampering with the city's telephone lines and sentenced to death. And despite the intervention of the community leaders, the Jewish communal leaders of Salonika, The 2 Jews were executed in March 1923. Jewish taxpayers as well came under especially close scrutiny and had to pay disproportionately high taxes. Jews could no longer print Hebrew or Judeo-Spanish lettering on their store signs. Property was expropriated from Jews, and the ancient Jewish graveyard in Salonika was desecrated. The fascist party, Tria Epsilon, founded in 1927, found ample support among the deprived refugees who were willing to blame communities and Jews for their misfortune. In April 1930, a Jew of Kavala in northern Greece was falsely charged with ritual murder. The person was found innocent, but only after Jewish shops had been attacked and the entire Jewish community in Kavala was terrorized. In 1931, anti-Semitic propaganda circulated during the Salonican elections. And then we have the Campbell riots. This incident was triggered by news that a Jew had participated in a meeting in Sofia which adopted a resolution for an independent Macedonia. Tria Epsilon launched a campaign against the foreign and communist Jews who they said had betrayed Greece. The quarter of Campbell, one of the Jewish community's sites in Salonika, was set on fire after an early attempt in the neighborhood of Toowoomba had failed. The Campbell riots erupted on the 23rd of June 1931. 250 Jewish families were attacked and their homes were set on fire. Shortly after the riots, one of Salonika's most prominent Jewish families, the Rekenatis, organized an exodus to Palestine of most of the Jews living in the Campbell neighborhood. These Jews, interestingly enough, were to man the ports of Haifa and Yafo with many skilled longshoremen. Other Jews left for France, the United States, and South America. But Jews also think quickly in Salonika. They begin to protect themselves, and now we have the formation of young bands of armed Jews that guard the Jewish neighborhoods. In 1929, our very independent Jewish communities in Greece now tried to organize one federation of the countrywide Greek Jewish communities. The Jews of Greece needed a national organization. The Jews held 2 preparatory conferences before 1936, but the Greek government intervened and opposed the establishment of such a representative body. This is similar, of course, to the B'nai B'rith in England and the Alliance in France. Greek Jews were also facing secularization in a way that they had not witnessed before. As more Jewish children began to attend Greek secondary schools after 1930, they slowly joined secular youth groups. You have increasing socialization between Jewish children and non-Jewish Greeks, resulted in more Jews converting to Christianity in order to get married. Because in Greece, the state prohibited marriage between people of different religions. One partner had to accept the other person's religion before consummating the marriage. The state prohibited marriage, as I said, between different religions. And photographs of the period show this new generation beginning to cast off the traditional markers of community membership. They exchanged their parents' clothes for Western-style clothes. They became looser in their religious observance, and they mingled with their non-Jewish neighbours. Cafes and movie theatres sprung up around Salonika's shoreside promenade to cater for this new cohort of semi-Europeanized Jewish bourgeoisie. John Metaxas' overthrow of the government in 1936 and his establishment of a military dictatorship in Greece with the backing of the king made the Jews feel more secure of their place in Greek society. He insisted to the Jews that the Greek state would continue to, quote, nourish the same feeling of sympathy for Jewish citizens which had previously existed. But this domestic tranquility would only last a few years until the arrival of Nazi Germany. On October the 28th, 1940, an ultimatum was sent to the Greeks by Mussolini demanding immediate surrender to Italian forces that were now gathered in the Albanian passes. The answer by Prime Minister Metaxas was a resounding "Ochi," no, and Greece was thus drawn into the Second World War. Greeks were mobilized, Jews as well as Christians, and in a few months the Italians were driven back, only to be rescued from complete humiliation by the arrival of the Germans. On April the 6th, 1941, the Germans invaded, and on April the 21st, they entered Athens, after which they seized all of Greece, including Crete. Of course, most of us know what happens when Nazi Germany invades a European country. But let us think about this for a moment. In 1939, as I write here, there were over 70,000 Jews in Greece living in communities that had histories stretching back over 2,000 years, the Romaniat, or whose family memories took them back to the rich brocade of medieval Islamic Spain, the Sephardi Jews. After the Holocaust, in 1945, just after the end of the repatriations, the total Jewish presence in Greece was given as 10,000. What would affect them most was where they were living. And this would determine what happened to our Jews under the Nazis. For example, on the island of Zante, all of the Jews, 275 of them, were saved by the efforts of its archbishop and mayor, while on nearby Corfu, the mayor and chief of police declared a public holiday on the day that the Jews had been deported. But let's think for a moment a little bit more about Zante, or Zakynthos, the island, because the story here is truly heroic. When the island's mayor, Lucas Care, was ordered at gunpoint to provide the occupying Germans with a list of all of the island's Jews, he and the metropolitan bishop, Chrysostomos, turned over only two names, Chrysostomos and Care. If the Jews were to be deported, the bishop is said to have maintained they too would have to go. While the bishop and the mayor, photographed here, argued with the Germans, all the Jews were taken and hidden in the mountains with Christian families. The mayor, the bishop, the chief of police, and every member of the Christian population worked together to hide the island's Jews. Only the old and sick remained behind in the island's main town. The SS planned to have them picked up by ship en route deporting Jews from Corfu, but ultimately did not do so. No ship came to the island for them, no one was deported, and all survived the war. This was a unique example in Europe. While virtually no Jews have lived in Zakynthos for over 50 years, the inhabitants and their descendants living abroad still regard the island as their homeland. In Thrace, the Bulgarians handed the 5,000 Jews to the Germans on the Danube, and their fates were sealed at Treblinka. None of the Jews of Crete survived, and today the Jewish quarter in Chinia has only its empty synagogue, abandoned by Jews and Christians alike. What about those Greek Jews who were able to escape? Where could they go? The fascinating thing is that it was dependent on the Jews' personal relations with non-Jews. In areas where Jews and Christians lived separately with little interaction, Jews would not have known where to turn for help. It would be next to impossible for a Jewish family to try and find refuge with people with whom it had had no previous contact, or with whom it had had differences, as may have been the case in Salonika, especially when one considers that to help a Jew was a capital crime under Nazi rule. In Athens, on the other hand, Jews had more social interactions with non-Jewish Greeks to whom they could turn for aid and shelter. And this explains the large number of Jews who were hidden in the mountains around Athens and Ioannina. In 1941, on the eve of the Second World War, there were 1,950 Jews left in Ioannina. When hostilities broke out, many of the Ioannina Jews fled to the mountains. Those who remained fell under the Italian occupation until 1943, when the Italians capitulated to the Allies. With the German takeover, the Jews were almost immediately segregated, and in March of 1944, 1,870 Jews were arrested in Ioannina, shipped to Larissa, and from there by cattle car to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where nearly all of them perished. But let's return to Salonika. The delay here of the German authorities in implementing programmatic anti-Semitic measures can be explained by their use of the Jews during this time in acquiring the necessary information and organization, the history, the wonderful history of the Jews of Salonika, before the Nazis could proceed to a thorough looting of the community's assets, estimated in 1945 as having a value of 18 million gold sovereigns. So even though the Jewish community was placed under the jurisdiction of the Gestapo, which closed the numerous Jewish clubs, organizations, and schools, a false sense of security persisted. And then the Germans began to mobilize the Jews. After a massive anti-Semitic campaign in the local press, the first collective action against the Jews was taken in 1942. On the 11th of July, 1942, male Jews between the ages of 18 and 45 were ordered to gather at the Platia Eleftheria, the Freedom Square in Salonika, to register for forced labor. About 7,000 men stood for hours in the hot sun, some being forced to do physical exercise. Subsequently, they went to work for the Wehrmacht on the construction of roads and airfields. Most Jews were not deported until spring 1943. Until that moment, they had been prisoners facing severe famine in Salonika. Everything that the region's farmers produced, wheat, butter, cheese, oil, olives, fruits, and nut, was stolen by the Germans. Even the fish that Salonika's commercial fisheries pulled from the sea were taken away. What the occupying forces did not need was sent to Germany, leaving many, many Jews starving and others. And during 1 year of the occupation alone, 520,000 tons of food and other commodities were shipped out of Salonika to Germany. Over 40,000 Jews were deported from Salonika in August 1943 to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Virtually all were murdered on arrival. 96% of the population were deported and killed. It took 15 train loads to empty Salonika of its Jews. And of course, there's so much that has been written about the experience of Greek Jews, but I wanted to draw your attention to the testimony of the late Yaakov or Jack Handeli, who really gives us the sense of the difference for Greek Jews in particular, what it felt like to be in these extermination camps. And this is what he writes. Greek Jews suffered more than others, and this was mainly for two reasons. The first was that we were from the Mediterranean. I was born only 50 yards from the sea. We were used to a much milder climate than the one we had to get used to in Central Europe. The second reason was the language barrier. Ashkenazic Jews who knew Yiddish could understand the Germans. We could not understand them and had trouble adapting to the climate. These two factors caused deaths among the Greek Jews from the beginning. Within 3 months of our arrival in Auschwitz, 50% of us were no longer alive. Despite their physical strength, Greek Jews died like flies. I recall how men went out of their way to prove to the Germans. Yet the fact remains that only 4% of the Greek Jews survived. No other Jewish community had as high a mortality rate. What about after the war? Well, in 1945, Greece's Central Board of Jewish Communities was set up, that long-awaited national organization that could take care of its Jews. The Greek state became the first in Europe to return Jewish properties which had been confiscated in the course of the war. But it waived its lawful right of inheritance to those property whose owners had not left descendants to the fourth degree. And the property of the deceased was transferred to a common fund to aid Jews that had been impoverished by the war. Immediate help, of course, was given by the Joint, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, and the Jewish Agency. But there was also an unstable political climate and a severe economic crisis throughout Greece. The bitter process of property reclamation made many Jews feel as if they were unwelcome strangers in their homeland. For most of these survivors, like in post-war Greeks, proved untenable, and at least half left for Palestine. But I want us to return to Salonika for a moment. One fascinating anthropological event that occurred after Greek Jews returned to Salonika and other places in Greece were the group weddings that occurred and the subsequent baby boom caused as a result of them. Between 1945 and 1947, 39 similar group weddings took place in Salonika, 22 in 1946 alone. Most of the participants in these weddings were camp survivors. These weddings took place in the building of the Matanot Le'Avionim, which houses the Jewish school today in Salonika, and was a charity organization giving meals to poor pupils until the war. And one bride reported, "We were very poor. I did not have money to buy a wedding dress. All the girls wanted to get married and to make a family, to go to Israel and to America. Therefore, they married us all together. I got married with 3 of my friends, 5 couples on one side, 5 on the other, the rabbi, Malkul Molcho, and some men from the community in the middle." And these weddings were something special to the Jewish community in Salonika. After getting married, many couples shared their accommodation with 2 or 3 other couples until each one was able to move to their own flat or decided to emigrate. Marriage was viewed by individuals and the communities, which obviously encouraged these marriages, as a step forward either to facilitate emigration or to facilitate re-establishment of the Jews in Salonika. The communities even gave sewing machines to some couples as a dowry. And I think it's important to point out that marriages were both a psychological and economic necessity in these post-war years. And here we have another group wedding, this time in Yanina in 1946. Women in particular, who were left without any family members to support them, were under pressure to marry. In many instances, they got married to older men whose wives and children had been killed in the camps. The result of the post-war conditions was, of course, also an emigration of 3,000 to 5,000 Greek Jews to Western Europe, to the United States, to Latin America, and to Israel. And today, Jews represent 0.001% of the total population of Salonika, the second largest city of the Greek national state. And perhaps we should think for a moment about our famous Israeli singer, Yehuda Polika, a contemporary Israeli pop singer of Sephardic descent, who sings plaintively of Glikami Saloniki, my sweet Salonika, and laments his condition of exile from his Greek home. This is the history of our elusive Jews of Greece. But before I finish, I want to take you to one more place that I really think is worth visiting if you, at any point in the future, make that trip into Greece. This is a place of fusion for me between the Sephardi Jews that I've talked about and the Romaniot as well that we have met. It is Veroa. Once Salonika had become important, Veroa served as the daughter city to Salonika. We know that there were Jews living in Veroa from at least the time of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. At this time, the Jews living in Veroa would have been Romaniot Jews. But we know that Sephardim soon joined them, and we think that at its peak, Veroa had as many as 600 Jews living there. So I want you to imagine Veroa and Salonika really keep close professional ties. The main commercial interests of the Salonika Jews were in the areas of textiles, and Veroa was surrounded by springs and running water for washing clothes and especially for dyeing them as well. The Jewish Sephardi industrialists that we've met in Salonika obtained raw materials from Veroa, purchasing wool from here and bringing them to be used in their textile factories. Veroa also produced then fine kosher cheeses that were in constant demand in Salonika up until modern times. And although there is no Jewish community in Veroa now, we do have remnants of a bustling Jewish presence. For example, the Jewish women of Veroa used to go down this path to the stream and use it as their mikveh, and you can still see today the steps down to a small changing room next to the stream. On the walls of a few houses, there are still these signs that remind us of this strong connection that the Greek Jews had with Jerusalem. "If I forget thee, Jerusalem," is written on the outside of some of these houses. And the synagogue itself has been renovated, can be visited, should be visited. The old synagogue was destroyed in an earthquake and rebuilt in 1850. Money was provided by the Ottoman Sultan himself for the synagogue in Varroa. Notice, if you can, in the middle of this picture, the Ottoman floor of the renovated synagogue. More recently, the Greek government had the synagogue renovated and repainted again. What else do we see in Varroa? Well, across the river, about 10 minutes walk from this synagogue, there was a magnificent Jewish cemetery in an area that was once outside the city. When the town expanded, it became near the center of the city. And on that location was built a basketball and soccer field. And the tombstones, the Jewish tombstones, were moved and placed on the turbines surrounding the field. And here are some of them that still can be seen today. As we said before, unfortunately, most of our Jews were exterminated by the Holocaust in Greece. Today, there are 4,100 Jews living in Greece. And there is no difference anymore between the Romaniot and the Sephardi Jews of Greece. But if you pray in Yanina, in the synagogue, you would follow the Romaniot tradition. And if you pray today in Salonika in the synagogue, or even in Athens, you would be following the Sephardi tradition. Today, definitely older people do speak Ladino, but not the younger ones. Thank you so much for joining me on this important journey of the Jews of Greece.